What if Goliath defeated David? Imagine the valley quieting as a giant lifts his spear to the sky, the morning sun flaring along bronze scales like a living sunset, and a boy with a sling standing small enough to be mistaken for a shadow. Imagine the stone not singing. Imagine courage colliding with silence. We know how the story is told, with a whisper that becomes a roar, a single shot that topples a legend. But what happens if the legend never falls? Tonight, we'll walk into that valley and take a different path out of it, one that leaves footprints across faith, culture, and history. First, let's remember the way the story goes for most of us. The armies of Israel and the Philistines face off in the valley of Elah, hills like sleeping animals on either side, and a dry stream bed winding through the center. The Philistines send out their champion, Goliath of Gath, towering in armor that clinks like cookware and thunder. Day after day, he taunts the Israelites, challenging anyone to single combat to decide the battle. No one steps forward. King Saul, tall himself but suddenly smaller in spirit, offers reward and marriage to the one who dares. But fear has a way of bending even the tallest trees. Then comes David, a shepherd boy bringing bread and news to his brothers. He hears the giant's words, and something inside refuses to bend. He declines armor because it feels like a costume that doesn't fit, and walks into the valley with a staff, a sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream. The Philistine laughs. David answers with faith. The sling whirls, the stone flies, and Goliath falls, face to the earth, the sound of it echoing off hills that never forget. David's courage breaks the stalemate, the Philistines scatter, and a new future opens. David rises from obscurity, becomes a favorite at court, outlives Saul's jealousy and civil war, and finally unites the tribes. He captures Jerusalem, makes it the capital, brings the ark into the city with dancing in the streets, and lays groundwork for a temple his son Solomon will build. That temple, music, priests, sacrifices, a city lifted into song, becomes the heartbeat of a people. The Psalms, many attributed to David, become a language for the soul, and the phrase David versus Goliath becomes a shorthand for the underdog's miracle. That's the timeline engraved in most of our imaginations. Now let's step back to the moment before the stone, not to defy anyone's faith but to explore the power of possibility, the way a single event can change the river's flow. What if David's sling jerks at the last instant? What if a breeze nudges the stone wide, or the giant's movement throws off the aim? The pebble clacks off bronze, bounces harmlessly into dust. In the heartbeat that follows, Goliath surges forward with the confident rage of a man who has never been contradicted by the battlefield. David, still young enough to be surprised by time, backsteps. He is quick, but not as quick as fate when it shifts weight. The shepherd stumbles. The champion's shadow covers him. No one needs details to understand what comes next. From the ridges, the men of Israel grasp the scene as if seeing a wall collapse. Their hope, this brave, unexpected hope, has fallen. Goliath raises his voice and his sword, a signal and a sentence at once, and the Philistine line pours into the valley like a single dark wave. Panic begets panic. Saul shouts for order. Jonathan runs to cover the retreat, but fear has already spread through the ranks like a fire through dry grass. The Israelites do not stand. They scatter to the hills and the paths home. The Philistines pursue only so far, enough to taste fear and victory, to plunder and to make their point. In the days that follow, the consequences harden into policy. The Philistines consolidate their control along the coast and push outposts deeper into the foothills, sending patrols to watch the passes and exact tribute. Smiths in Israelite villages are restricted or co-opted, a return to a hard reality in which iron is both technology and leverage. Saul, embarrassed and weakened, sues for a truce structured like a leash. He keeps his crown, but only by bowing to a new line in the sand, a tax in grain, a supply of laborers for Philistine projects, a promise of no large standing armies in the hill country. The songs that used to be sung at night grow quieter. The ones about victory are folded and put away. What vanishes first is not faith, but momentum. Without David's victory, Saul's court never acquires the young warrior poet whose charisma could glue cracked loyalties together. There is no winning general to gather the tribes after Saul's death. No patient rival who refuses to kill the king in the cave and wins hearts by restraint. Jonathan remains a rare light, courageous and loyal. But without David, he is only a prince in a diminished kingdom, brave on skirmish lines that shrink with every season. When Saul eventually falls, not on Mount Gilboa perhaps, but some battlefield made necessary by politics and pride, the succession becomes a chessboard with too many hands. The tribe of Benjamin presses one claim, Ephraim another. Judah, lacking David, lacks a unifying banner. A civil struggle sputters under Philistine oversight. Tribal leaders are encouraged to quarrel because divided neighbors make easier neighbors. Jerusalem, that hilltop stronghold the Jebusites still hold, remains unclaimed. No one has the clout or the coalition to take it and declare, "Here." Without that capture, there is no jubilant procession of the Ark into a new capital. The Ark stays where it is, perhaps in Kiriath Jearim, perhaps moved cautiously from shrine to shrine when politics demand a show of unity. Worship remains a patchwork quilt of altars and high places, priestly families navigating local traditions and pressures. The music changes too. There are still songs, there are always songs, but the corpus we call psalms grows differently. Maybe the sons of Korah and Asaph still write, but without David's name to organize and inspire, the collection is thinner on royal psalms. The shepherd's harp does not thread the centuries with its particular grammar of grief and praise. Instead, the people learn to pray in the language of survival, in choruses tuned to long-suffering hope rather than a king's covenant. Without the Davidic dynasty, the idea of a house chosen forever doesn't plant its flag in Jerusalem's stones. The prophets who will later thunder or whisper to kings find themselves addressing councils and elders instead, or chieftains who rotate with elections and betrayals. Messages change tone when their targets change shape. Some warnings grow sharper in the absence of centralized power. It is easier to tell scattered leaders to stop chasing idols than it is to critique a royal court. Other hopes grow vaguer without a throne to anchor them. The vision of a righteous ruler who shepherds the nation with justice still exists. People can long for that in any system. But it does not crystallize around the name David in the same way. When families teach children to hope, they point to judges and deliverers from the past, Deborah, Gideon, Samuel, and tell them a new one will come. The dreams of peace are less palace and more hillside, a longing for a leader who can knit a quilt tighter than anyone else has managed. Outside the hills, the world keeps turning. Aram in Damascus sharpens its ambitions. Ammon and Moab test borders like wolves test fences. The Philistines strengthen their towns, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron, and push trade with Egypt and the wider seas. In a generation or two, the great empires stir. Assyria flexes toward the west, the way storms gather over ridges and then break. When they come, they find not a unified kingdom but a mosaic. Tribes and towns negotiate separately, some bending quickly, others trying to hide in the folds of the hills. It is possible, even likely, that the northern highlands become a set of client territories sooner and more completely than in our familiar timeline. Without a strong Judah under a Davidic line, Jerusalem does not stand as a defensive hinge. Assyria's road through the Levant runs smoother. Culture is a tree grown in weather, and the winds have changed. Without a boy who took down a giant, the underdog story, at least in that form, never becomes the region's banner. People still tell tales of courage, Gideon's small army, Jael with the tent peg, Esther in a palace. But David versus Goliath is not the phrase that enters the world's bloodstream. Something precious does shift when that idiom is missing. The idea that a single small act of faith can topple a seemingly insurmountable power is still true in many hearts, but it doesn't have the same shorthand. Movements that might have rallied under that metaphor choose other symbols. Perhaps they say, as the jar broke before Midian, or as the sea opened for Moses, leaning on images of deliverance that are wider and more communal than personal heroism. Courage becomes less a sling and more a chorus. Here's a question to carry with you. If the world never learned to say, David versus Goliath, which story would become our universal underdog banner instead? Tell me your pick in the comments. Gideon, Esther, something else entirely. And if these careful, respectful thought experiments light up your imagination, Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey we take together. Art follows myth like a shadow follows light. Without David's surprising victory, later painters and sculptors have a different menu to choose from. The Renaissance does not carve a watchful young David before the fight. Perhaps it carves a vigilant Deborah, eyes lifted toward a storm on the horizon. Caravaggio doesn't paint David with Goliath's head. Maybe he paints the quiet courage of Esther stepping toward a doorway. Cathedral choirs still sing, but fewer anthems begin of David, and a different set of melodies travels across centuries. The harp remains a beautiful instrument, but its association is less with a shepherd king and more with the Levites who kept worship alive wherever worship was allowed. Pilgrims still walk hills, but the city they press toward looks different. Without Solomon's temple, Jerusalem is a respected but smaller shrine among many. The skyline does not carry the same weight in memories. Other towns, Shiloh rebuilt, Gibeon fortified, share the load. Even the language of law and leadership changes in subtle ways. Without a royal house as a narrative backbone, proverbs about kings and courts are fewer, or frame power with more suspicion and caution. Wisdom literature still teaches humility, honesty, and care for the poor, but its examples lean away from the throne and toward the marketplace, the field, the family gate where elders sit. Priests and prophets become the chief guardians of identity. They are the keepers of scrolls and memory instead of advisors to a dynasty. The sense of being a people chosen to model justice does not vanish, but the stage is smaller and the costumes simpler. Festivals in the agricultural calendar loom larger than royal anniversaries. The memory of a giant who did not fall becomes a warning against reckless challenges and a lesson in preparation. We teach our children to be brave, yes, but also to gather wisely, to craft strategy that does not rest on a single stone. Centuries later, when the great empires rush in, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, the story keeps bending. If there is no Temple of Solomon, then there is no temple to burn under Babylon's siege. A mainline trauma changes its face. Instead of smoke rising from a central sanctuary, there is the quieter sadness of many altars silenced, priestly families displaced, and sacred objects confiscated from storehouses across the land. Exile still sears identity. People still hang their harps on willows and wonder how to sing songs in a strange land. But the memory they reach for is not the fall of a single city, it is the closing of many doors at once. When Persian kings later allow returns and restorations, the rebuilding project is less about a single house of stone and more about collecting a scattered reverence back into a few common places. Perhaps a temple is finally built then, modest but beloved, not the descendant of a golden age, but the ancestor of a steady one. In this alternate timeline, later traditions that looked back to a son of David to frame hope would look instead toward a different title, a different metaphor. Some might emphasize the figure of a servant, a teacher, a prophet like Moses, or a shepherd who gathers without holding a scepter. Images that are already present in sacred texts, but take on brighter colors when the Davidic palette is dimmer. Communities who, in our familiar history, cherish the Davidic line as a way to understand redemption would articulate the same longing with a different melody, still centered on justice, mercy, and restoration, but less on royal blood and more on shared covenant. As always, the details of belief remain diverse and personal, and our exploration here is speculative and educational, not doctrinal. The point is not to prescribe faith, but to notice how a single story can tilt the angle of the light by which we read. We should not imagine that all courage goes missing because one boy falls. History is kind to quiet bravery when a people keep telling its stories, and the hill country has no shortage of them. A mother who smuggles bread while pretending to barter. A scribe who copies a law code by lamplight even when the wind threatens to snuff the flame. A village that decides to shelter strangers and teach their language because hospitality survives where armies do not. The heroic becomes less concentrated and more distributed, a net instead of a pillar, and that has its own power. The lesson younger generations learn is not only face your giants, but face the day with your neighbors. Would our world be poorer without the flash of David's victory? In art and idiom, perhaps? The statue that never stands on a square in Florence is a kind of absence you can feel with your eyes. The phrase that underdogs use on courtroom steps or in locker rooms becomes a different phrase, and maybe it doesn't travel as far. Yet loss in one place often means attention to another. Without David's name on so many songs, other names rise. Deborah, the mind like a blade. Ruth, the faithful heart. Samuel, the ear that still hears. The imagination of generations would spread its weight across those stories and others, and that spreading could steady them in storms. From a distance, it's tempting to reduce the difference to a single moral, to argue that if the giant stands, life becomes cynicism, and iron rules forever. But that is not how human beings live, and it is not how the texts we inherit speak. The Valley of Elah is one valley among many. There are seas that part without slings, lions' dens that close their mouths without swords, fires that leave no scorch mark on a single hair. Even when one story doesn't break our way, others do. Even when one stone misses, there are still 5 in the bag. And that brings us gently back to the valley, to consider why this simple tale reaches so far into us. It isn't only about a boy winning. It's about what it feels like to lift our eyes when we are small, to run into a space nobody else wants, to try. In our familiar timeline, trying leads to triumph and a crown. In this alternate path, trying leads to tragedy and a different kind of endurance. Both are true in the world. We need the stories where courage wins, and we need the ones where courage simply is. We need to teach both to our children so they grow brave without growing brittle. It may be that the most enduring change in this speculative world is not political or architectural, but psychological. We would walk through life slightly less convinced that one person can topple oppression in a single shot, and slightly more convinced that many people must carry hope up a hill, one step at a time. That is not a worse vision. It is a humbler one, and humility has a way of preparing rooms for miracles, even if they come slower than we want. So, what if Goliath defeated David? Then the world we know would carry different names and shapes. The harp's song would lean toward the minor keys of waiting. The capital on the hill might be a different hill, or many hills at once. The underdog would find other banners, and the giant would have a longer moment in the sun. But people would still plant vineyards, and scribes would still copy stories, and grandparents would still look at grandchildren and promise that justice will outlast bronze. The valley would still be there, and someday someone else would walk into it. Not with a sling, perhaps, but with something as simple and as fierce, a heart that refuses to kneel to fear. Our journey tonight is speculation, an educational what-if, offered with respect. It reminds us that history is not inevitable, that faith travels along roads both triumphal and quiet, and that hope can survive the day the giant does not fall. And when we return to the familiar story, as most of us will, perhaps we will hear in it not only the victory of a shepherd, but the invitation to be brave, together, in whatever valley we find ourselves tomorrow.